Reasoning is something that a lot of students struggle with, and this is something that I think a lot of students on this essay are hoping to capture those points for reasoning and analysis. So we're going to practice a little bit using an example from a student's paper who I was working with in class the other day. So in this case, you should know that his overall opinion or assertion, as stated in his thesis statement, is going to be remove. Okay, so to remove the monuments. So if this is the student's claim for a body paragraph, he's going to say that monuments that honor those who served for the Confederacy are viewed by some Americans as offensive. So that is going to be the focal point for his entire paragraph, right? And now he's got to find some evidence to support that. Well, one thing that this student was saying is he was saying that one thing that he found that showed that these monuments were offensive was he was watching this video from ABC News in which the mayor of Richmond, Mayor LeVar Stoney, was talking about his grandmother. And his grandmother was she was an African-American woman who raised him. LeVar Stoney is African-American as well. And so basically he was talking about his grandmother during the 1920s and how today, if she were still around, she would see these things as offensive. And so the student listened to the video several times to capture the correct quotation from LeVar Stoney, and this is what he said. "My grandmother would be offended by these things," meaning the monuments. "I want to be on her side." Okay, so one thing to know though is in between this claim, which we're going to focus the paragraph around, and the evidence here, in between that, the student needs to transition into the evidence he's about to use if it's the first time he's ever used it. And so he needs to provide some background or context before using it, just a sentence that helps to describe or summarize the source. Okay? So the student would need to think about, how can I summarize that source from ABC News? What was that whole source really talking about? Oh, well, it was a conversation between some major officials in the city of Richmond, Virginia, where they're talking to Martha Raddatz, I think her name is, the journalist. And in this video, they're talking about what should be done about these monuments in light of the tragedy and what happened in Charlottesville, that horrible white supremacist rally that took place, the white nationalists that showed up and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and there was a woman who was actually killed as a result of there was a counter protest going on, all kinds of stuff. So that's definitely something you guys should be aware of when you go to write this essay. That's one of the reasons why this is back in the news, or was back in the news. Okay, so anyway, so you have your context, you have your one sentence that helps to describe or summarize the source, what it's all about. You have your evidence. Now it's time for reasoning. So your job is to discuss how this evidence supports the claim. And remember, our claim is how these monuments are viewed by some Americans as offensive. Okay. So if I'm going after this piece of evidence, I'm going to want to talk about the different chunks in here. Okay, so some of the things, his grandmother would be offended. So one thing that I might want to talk about here, and I'm just going to kind of think about these different parts of the evidence and what I might want to say in my reasoning or my analysis, right? So LeVar Stoney's grandmother as an African-American woman who lived in the South would find these monuments to be offensive because of what they represent to her. And to her, he was saying in the interview that they would represent white supremacy and racism. Okay, so that's one thing. And he's saying here that he wants to be on her side. So it's important to Mayor Stoney to stand up for her and support her. Okay? So we could also talk about the fact that we could infer based on this that he was close with his grandmother, that he would care what his relatives think about what they're doing today and that kind of thing. I mean, he was talking about her and she's no longer around, right? But that he wants to be on her side. So those are all the sorts of things that I could put into this box, right? So I could say something like, as the Mayor LeVar Stoney cares deeply about what his grandmother would think about these monuments that are still standing in Richmond, because they have Monument Row, right, or Monument Avenue. On Monument Avenue. He believes that if she were still here today, she would be offended by these monuments because of what they represent, a symbol of racism and white supremacy. To honor her memory, it is important to Mayor Stoney that he see, this is where reasoning gets kind of sticky, right? You got to phrase it just so. It is important to Mayor Stoney that he is on the right side of history and does what he thinks she would want him to do. Work to remove these monuments. Okay, so you might notice I use some of the words, or I referred to some of the words that are up here in this piece of evidence. That's what you want to do in reasoning. Now also, if you notice, this is 1, 2, 3 lines long, okay? You don't want evidence to be longer than 3 lines long, by the way. If it is, you need to block quote it, and in that case, oh boy, you're getting into some bigger fish to fry. So you don't want to necessarily do that. If you notice here, though, 3 lines versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7.5. Okay, your reasoning or analysis in many cases will be about double the size of your evidence, because this is your opportunity to really dig into that evidence and show how it supports the claim. So let's just double check. Did I support the claim? Our claim, viewed by some Americans as offensive. All right. Okay, she would be offended, right? There I am. Okay, what they represent, a symbol of racism and white supremacy. So yes, I think I have done my job here. Yay. All right, so then my job would be to transition into my next piece of evidence that supports the same claim. I would look back at my green organizer sheet here for my evidence, and I would say, what other evidence on here shows that some of these monuments are deemed as offensive by some people, by some Americans? I would use that. I would aim to use that next, but I would transition into it. I would find something that connects these 2 pieces of evidence. Okay, then, just so you know, the pattern of a body paragraph, okay? It is claim is your first sentence. Then you've got to have your background, context, or description of your first source. Now, this is only 1 to 2 sentences. Try to squeeze it just into 1 if you can. And if you're using a source for the first time, that's where you give just a brief summary and overview of that source. Then you use your first piece of evidence, like I did above, right? Then you have your reasoning, which is 2 to 3 sentences. Notice I've got the amounts here. Then you transition into the next source and you repeat that pattern. Here's the background. Here's evidence 2. Now this might come from a different source. That'd be pretty cool because then you'd be synthesizing, right? Then you would have your reasoning, and then you'd have your link into the next paragraph. What is something to kind of wrap up this thought, in this case on how these monuments are seen as offensive by some Americans, that would lead us into the next paragraph. Maybe my next paragraph would talk about something like the white supremacist activity that's been happening around these monuments lately. Alrighty, so that's how reasoning works.